Today we will talk about the Gregorian Chant revival and the men who began that, the monks of Solesmes. So now, as we enter into the 19th century, there are specific challenges for the church. One of those is social thought. Some of the things that are happening in that time period at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, it's a very turbulent time. You think about the American Revolution and the ideas which came about from that. Thomas Jefferson, who's building upon Locke's ideas, and what that leads to with the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is a revolt against monarchy, which was quite new for Europeans. And there's a whole range of things that are upended because of that. There are also developments within psychology. We think about Sigmund Freud practicing in Vienna, psychiatry, and education. Education is becoming more and more available to the masses. And there are also significant technological and scientific advances along with abuses, but you think about the Industrial Revolution, which is beginning at this point. With that, we have the rise of nationalism, and if you know anything about the differences between ways that Americans view nationalism and the way that Europeans view nationalism, they're quite different. The American ideal of nationalism has tended to be of the more positive variety, inclusiveness, whereas in Europe, nationalism has tended to be more exclusive. Who's not a part of us? Who speaks our language? Who doesn't speak our language? So you can see that in Europe, generally speaking, nationalism is kind of a negative aspect. And of course, the height of that would be Nazi Germany, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Imperialism is also an important factor. That's one of the reasons of the American colonies revolting against imperialism. And you have many important militaristic and economic rivalries that are happening at the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century. The church's decline of influence is also a very important thing, a huge challenge for the church. The church is caught between the need to advance and the desire to hold on to what is familiar and the traditional world. The music of the 19th century tends to reflect the tensions of the world in major flux at the time. And so there are several simultaneous and interwoven paths of development for the church. And one of those paths is music which has its roots in the sacred concert works of the 17th and 18th centuries, those oratorios that we talked about. And the other is the music that continued the concerted mass tradition, like Mozart and Haydn. So if you think that music with roots in oratorios, that would be like the Bach B minor Mass or Handel's Messiah, where the concerted mass tradition would be, like the Coronation Mass of Mozart or the Lord Nelson Mass of Haydn. So let's talk about the first one, the sacred concert works. So the music which has its roots in oratorios mostly. So they tend to be very grandiose and nationalistic, very ceremonious, but also harmonically progressive. Berlioz, who's a French composer, his music was a product of the Enlightenment and is secular in nature. And he writes this work, even though it's called the Grand Messe de Mar, or it's a requiem, it is a little bit more secular in in outlook, if you will. So again, that title is The Grand Messe de Mort, or what we would call a Requiem. It's by Hector Berlioz. Again, he's a French composer. And this piece is massive. It's massive because it requires so many musicians. It has a tremendous orchestration, woodwinds, brass instruments, including 4 offstage brass ensembles placed at the corners of the concert stage. The percussion alone requires 10 players to play 16 timpani. Those are the big kettle drums, 2 bass drums, and 10 pairs of cymbals. Listen to what the orchestra calls for. The chorus. The chorus calls for 80 sopranos, 60 tenors, and 70 basses with a tenor solo. Huge choir. And the strings, these are not the normal sizes of orchestras you'd find today by any means, but the string section for this work required 25 violins, 20 violin number 1, 25 violin 2, 20 violas, 20 cellos, and 18 of the big double basses. So it is outstanding. I mean, it's huge. And so we're going to take a movement from that, the Rex Tremendae. And this comes from the sequence of the Requiem Mass. The full sequence is entitled Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath. And this is one section of that called the Rex Tremendae, and translated means Great King. This is the 4th movement, and it portrays this awful majesty in a most dramatic fashion. The Rex Tremendae contains very contrasting opposites. The choir sings this beseeching section, asking for mercy, asking for help. And they also sing majestically as well. This was never intended for actual liturgical use. This is a concert work, even though it takes its texts from the Requiem Mass. Now here you see the opening score for Rex Tremendae. And as before, we're not going to listen to the whole piece here. You'll need to listen to that on your own. It begins with this huge sound, with the choir singing Rex, Rex, Rex Tremendae Majestatis. But then you'll hear also these very, very, very soft sections right next to the big loud ones. Let's take a little bit of listen to it. Imagine all those singers and orchestra. It's soft. You can kind of hear it does sound a little bit nationalistic, right? So grand. And what you can hear in that little section, you hear the way he layers the entrances of the basses, then tenors, then sopranos. And now the choir, the sopranos, sing very pleadingly. And then the basses. Beautifully sung. Salvame, which means save me. counterpoint here. Loud and soft right next to each other. And now so quiet. I'm going to move on now. And it's like, wow, it's really kind of a cool piece. I just love the contrast between super loud and then so soft. It's really cool. So now let's look at the other side, the concerted mass tradition that follows that tradition. So the music continued the tradition of Mozart and Haydn. But it's now on a larger scale. Things are done larger orchestras, broader harmonic vocabulary. We're entering into the Romantic period of music. And you remember the Baroque period had emotional expression, and the Classical period had emotional restraint and balance. Now, as we enter the Romantic period, it swings back to exuberant expressions of emotionalism. Especially as we move towards the end of the 19th century. Many of these were inspired by earlier music, but now have contemporary harmonies. One of the works that we're going to listen to is by Anton Bruckner, who's placed right in the middle of the 19th century, very much romantic, and his piece is called Locus Iste. This piece is modeled after 16th century motets, very much in the style of Palestrina, but it has a contemporary formal structure that's symmetrical, and it has an alternating homophonic and contrapuntal writing with more of a chromatic texture. This is his piece Locus Iste. Again, modeled after those 16th century motets, but now with contemporary harmony and more of a structure than Palestrina or De Victoria or Bird. Listen to the bass line. Chromaticism in the bass line. It's also very emotional too. You can continue listening to Locus Iste at your own on your own from Moodle. Let's continue, and we'll talk about Plain Chant Revival and the monks of Solesmes. Dom Prosper Geranger was a young priest of the Diocese of Le Mans in France, and in 1833 he undertook the restoration of Benedictine monastic life on the site of an old monastery at Solesmes. And this was about 40 years uh, after the French Revolution. If you remember, in the French Revolution, it was not only the monarchy and the nobility that the people revolted against, but it was also the Catholic Church, because the Church and its hierarchy had been so interwoven into the corruption of the French state. And so many religious orders were expelled, monasteries were taken over. Even if you think about um, the Brothers of the Christian schools, who we've mentioned before, we mentioned St. John Baptist de La Salle, who founded the order in Reims, France. Uh, Even this French order was expelled from France for about 40 years because of, as I mentioned, the corruption that had existed and the tension that had existed between the people and the essentially the elites, which were many in the church. So, at this time, after the French Revolution, religious life began to return. Religious orders began to return to France to reestablish their monasteries and their orders in France. And Don Guéranger was one of those people, and he helped to reestablish Benedictine monastic life in France. And he's important because in his restoration of the monastery, he wanted to renew the prayer life of the Benedictine monks who would follow him. And Benedictine monks live by they live by a rule, but it boils down to two things, and it's in their motto. In Latin, it is ora et labora, which translated into English means prayer and work. These two things are vital to their life as monks. As you would imagine, prayer is so important, and the prayer life of the church is an integral part of the life of monks. And one of the ways that Don Guéranger wanted to do this was through the revitalization of the Tridentine Rite. The Tridentine Rite is the rite that was established and the reforms that were established at the Council of Trent. The word Tridentine comes from the word Trent, where the council was held. And you remember that the Council of Trent was the ecumenical council that followed the Protestant Reformation. It was the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. And so, in the early 19th century, Don Guéranger wanted to revitalize the beauty of the Tridentine Rite. He also wanted to restore Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant is not only important to the Mass and the way it was exercised in the Tridentine Rite, but also in the Office of Hours. The Liturgy of the Hours is those liturgies which the monks and priests pray, morning prayer, evening prayer, noon prayer, night prayer. The life of a monk is regulated by those times of prayer as well, and chant is used throughout their life. And so he's credited with restoring Gregorian chant. So what were some of the keys to restoring Gregorian chant? Because that's really what we're interested in. So some of the keys to restoring the execution of Gregorian chant focused on just that, how to sing the chants. He was asking his monks to respect the primacy of the text in their singing. And as we know from when we study Gregorian chant, it is the primacy of the text that was most important in the past. But much of that, the way that chant had been executed, had been lost for, hundreds of years. He also focused on, and his monks focused on the pronunciation of the Latin, proper pronunciation, proper accentuation of the Latin, and the phrasing of the Latin with the chant. And this all with an eye to guaranteeing the intelligibility of the texts in the service of prayer. Don Guéranger placed the task of restoring the authentic melodies into the hands of one of his monks. Now, if you remember back to Palestrina, I mentioned when we talked about Palestrina, who is so important because his compositions are so influential. But one of the things about Palestrina was that during the Council of Trent, which was when Palestrina was working and composing in Rome, he was given the task by the Council Fathers to modify the Gregorian chants. So, and the reason the Council Fathers wanted him to modify the chants was to make it easier for the people to sing. So Palestrina, in the 16th century, then changed some of the keys of Gregorian chant. He changed and truncated. He shortened all those beautiful melismas and reordered some of it. So the Gregorian chant, after the Council of Trent, had been altered by Palestrina and those he was working with. But the monks at Solesmes wanted to restore Gregorian chant to what it was before that. And so how did they do that? Well, they used what they found in their studies. And one of them was the St. Gall Codex 359. And they found this, they discovered it in 1830. And part of the problem was that the notation that they used, and we actually saw this when we discussed Gregorian chant and when we discussed the old neumes before Guido d'Arezzo, it was those little squiggles above the words. Well, the monks in the 1800s, they couldn't really read that, but they knew that it pointed to an older, more authentic tradition than the practice that they had been doing in the 19th century. So it referenced the older style because what they had were the results of Palestrina's modifications, the cut melismas, the altered melodies, and the way that they sang it in the 1800s had been using the music as the primary way of singing it. So if you think about Gregorian chant, you've got basically two ways to sing Gregorian chant. You can accentuate the text, or you can accentuate the music. And a lot of singers still today have problems with this. It's not about the music. Gregorian chant, plainsong, is about the text. And so they realized when they found the St. Gall Codex 359 that this pointed to an older style of singing. Well, then they discovered the Montpellier School of Medicine Codex 159. They discovered that in 1847. And it was from the 11th century, and it had notes similar to the St. Gall Codex 359 and the letter names of the notes. So the Montpellier Codex 159 was almost like a Rosetta Stone for Gregorian chant, deciphering the old melodies and the earlier styles of singing. This was a huge discovery for the restoration of plainsong. So, as I mentioned, there were these two different styles of singing, and in the 1800s, most people used this melodic-based type of singing where they didn't really care about the Latin text because, as we get into the 19th century, more and more people did not speak Latin, and so it was much more foreign to them. So why sing a text-based style of chant? Why not do it more melodic-wise? Well, of course, we know that that was incorrect. It should be text-based and not melodic-based. In 1903, so about 70 years after the monks of Solesmes began restoring Gregorian chant, they received the blessing of Pope Pius X in 1903 for all of their scholarly research. And we'll talk more about what the Pope wrote in 1903. But it's important to realize beyond just liturgical music, the Catholic Church, and these monks, it's important to realize that the restoration of chant that was begun by the monks of Solesmes spurs a general interest in older music. Before this hadn't really existed. People wrote music and they went on to the next thing. There hadn't really been a study in older music. And it also gives rise to some would say it gave rise to the entire study of musicology, studying older music. This hadn't really existed before the monks of Solesmes began their research. So we're grateful to the monks of Solesmes for that. One of the older movements, reform movements, was known as the Cecilians, and that will be the topic of our next couple of classes, discussing what the Cecilians, this varied group of musicians, what they were interested in for the church. And that's it for today.